Good afternoon. I apologize for being late, but there is still caucus meeting for the Democratic caucus, so I'm hoping a few members will join us when that does end, but I wanted to not keep you waiting. I want to thank everybody for coming today and thank Assemblymember Bill Berryhill for also being here, and hopefully we'll have a few other people able to take time out of their busy schedules today to join us. About this time last year, the Select Committee on Lowering California's High School Dropout Rate held its first hearing where we first examined the severity of the crisis and its effects on our community. And we heard a lot of data in our first hearing, and I'm glad that we're able to have one of our speakers from that first hearing back today to kind of wrap up what we've covered over these hearings and what we can do to move forward from this point. There are a lot of different groups working on studying the dropout crisis, but not a lot of action happening at a state level at this point. And my hope is that today we can really filter some of what's going on and start moving the conversation beyond study, beyond discussion, not waiting for perfect data, but really start taking action to start seeing results, particularly in the worst affected school districts and areas of our state. When I planned this hearing, what I had in mind was taking the recommendations of the National Conference of State Legislators Task Force on Dropouts and having a discussion about those recommended actions that each state could take, as well as the recommendations of our featured programs to see what could be turned into future actions. But unfortunately, the recommendations from the NCSL task force aren't quite ready, and they won't be released until the fall. We do have some idea what's going to be in those reports, but again, we do have a speaker who was present when that task force was meeting and coming up with some of its recommendations, so hopefully we'll be able to cover that ground even without having the national report out. The good news is that out of the last task force hearing, that California's already doing a number of the things that were being recommended at the national level. So I think that we'll see positive results coming out. But I have a lot of stuff to cover. I'm going to try to work this in so that we can spend more time with each individual presenter. So if there's, but I first want to give Assemblymember Bill Berryhill an opportunity to have some opening remarks.
Well, I'll just be real brief. Appreciate you holding this hearing, Assemblymember Huber. Look forward to hearing the results of some of the studies and looking into this. Serving on a school board for 11 years, I think from my point of view, I think the schools, and it's all well and good to believe that every kid is going to go to college, but at the end of the day, every kid won't be going to college. Every kid doesn't want to go to college. And we have to make school relevant to their lives and relevant for them to keep them interested in school. And that's, I think, career tech and some of those kinds of programs work really well. So looking forward to hearing the panelists today, and we'll go from there. Thanks you all for coming.
Thank you. So let's not wait any longer for us to continue talking and get to some of our exciting speakers today. So if we can please welcome Russ Rumberger, the director of the California Dropout Research Project. In addition to his role as the director for the California Dropout Research Project, he has also been working with the National Conference of State Legislators Task Force and with the California Mayor's Education Roundtable, and he has already done a number of papers on this topic, has wonderful data, and now he's back to speak about some recommended actions that were developed by the California Dropout Research Project and through his work with the Institute of Education Sciences. So welcome, Russ Rumberger.
Thank you very much for having me. So I want to this afternoon, what I want to talk about is a set of recommendations that came out of the California Dropout Research Project Policy Committee that Senator Steinberg was on and Assemblymember Gene Fuller was on. This was 2 years ago. And then also an Institute for Educational Sciences panel that I was on dropout prevention. So there's two different kind of groups that are speaking to this issue, and they focus somewhat on different levels of the system, as you'll see. But there is some overlap, and I think there's, and it's not just because I was involved with both groups, but two independent groups, and I think it gives us a little more legitimacy and belief that these recommendations are in fact valuable when two different groups tend to generate them. So I don't need to tell everybody in this room, but I think one of the things that's helped us in terms of the general issue of dropouts is when the President has acknowledged its importance. And as of, I think yesterday, I'm not sure if he said it this morning or yesterday's meeting he was at, but he's mentioned dropouts 3 times in major addresses, the first one in February 2009. So the fact that the President has recognized it, and I think also the federal government is putting more money in dropout prevention programs is a positive thing. So the project, just to remind everybody, is based at Santa Barbara. It's been going on for about 3 years, and it really has kind of 3 major activities. One of them is to commission research and synthesize research findings on the nature of the problem in the state. The second thing is to develop a policy agenda, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that we did through this committee that we had. And then thirdly is just to bring public awareness of this issue to as many people and as we can. And we do that through our publications and through our website and through media contacts and things like that. So the research, I'm only going to talk about the research in one dimension only right now anyway, and that is because I think it's really important. But what the project has done, for those that are not familiar with it, is look at 4 facets of the problem. You know, how bad it is and what the trends are, the economic and social consequences, the causes, and then ultimately the solutions, which is really, I think, which is what I think today's session is more about. So I'm going to really focus on solutions. But there's lots of information about this problem in California on our website for those that want to learn more about it. And I'll just highlight one statistic that I think is very telling about it, which is basically our graduation rate is lower now than it was 10 years ago. So at least on the one that's what's called the official rate, which is the top number. And the other thing that I should point out about that number is it's inflated. It's really too high. And there's a whole debate that's gone on at the national level about how we actually compute dropout and graduation statistics. I'm actually involved with a National Research Council panel that's going to release a report in the fall about how to measure better rates and what are the issues and things that states need to be accountable for. But lo and behold, the numbers that we now use are actually inflated. The bottom number is probably too low. It's a kind of another rate that the State Department computes. So if somebody were going to ask me what our true graduation rate is in California, I'd probably say it's somewhere in between. So it's probably about 75%, and there's some other data that suggests that. So the point being that it's definitely too low, and the second point being that it's probably worse than it was 10 years ago. So it means that we really need to attend this problem. So again, I'm not going to talk about consequences or causes or anything like that, except to say the following with respect to designing interventions. This is really a really short capsule summary of what we know from the research about the causes of dropout and what the implications are for solving it. One of them is that dropping out is not just an academic problem. It has both a social and an academic dimension to it, so that students are, one of the big predictors of dropping out is, of course, failing school, especially high school and 9th grade in particular. But there's there's a social dimension to the problem about other things besides academics are involved. So in thinking about solutions, we have to attend that fact, I would say. Second thing, we know that the dropping out process starts before high school, so that solving the problem only in high school is not going to be effective. It's probably even less costly to intervene before high school. So if we want to talk about kind of a statewide approach to solving the problem, we really have to talk about more than high school. But high school is clearly part of it. But we can talk actually about middle school, elementary school, and even preschool. And the third major conclusion of the research is that if we want to address this problem, we have to focus both on individual students, that is their performance in school, their attitudes, their behaviors, all those kind of things. But we also need to change or affect institutions that support them, families, schools, and communities. And I would conclude from the research that neither approach by itself is going to be sufficient. That is, if we only try to kind of fix students or help students, we're not going to be successful. And if we only try to help institutions, we're not going to be successful. But we actually have to do both, and that makes it, of course, harder to solve the problem. So let me talk about solutions kind of in two perspectives. One of them is types of solutions that have been designed or looked at, and I think there's kind of three basic types. One of them is programmatic, where the focus is on students. That's what I mentioned just before. So in other words, support programs, alternative schools. As many of you know, we have a very extensive alternative education system in our state. We actually have more alternative education high schools in California than regular comprehensive high schools, about 1,500 to 1,000. So we actually have this huge shadow system or alternative system out there. So one approach, and a historical approach, is that we basically provide these support programs for students either within regular schools or outside regular schools. The second approach is comprehensive, which is where we try to fix the whole school, and that's kind of more the focus now of the current Obama administration on this turnaround model, which is let's just fix the whole school. So it's a comprehensive school reform model, or it's a model whereby schools are somehow working with communities in partnerships to provide services or whatever they may be. And then the third one, which is maybe more the province of the state to some extent, is changing the system. And that's harder still. So in other words, thinking about this issue of capacity building, which I'll speak to more in a moment. But also state policy can have a direct effect on dropout and graduation rates through things such as setting the compulsory schooling age, setting graduation requirements, and things like that. So each of these approaches has advantages and disadvantages, and I'll just briefly mention them. Programmatic solutions are, by and large, easier to design, fund, implement, and to evaluate. So in other words, they're much more kind of cohesive and targeted because of their nature. But at the same time, that's the limitation of them, which is they typically only impact a small number of kids. So a typical program might have 50 or even 100 kids in it. So it might help those kids very, very much, but it won't affect larger populations of kids. So in places where the dropout problem is relatively small, that is affecting relatively few students, a programmatic approach may be useful. But if it's large, then it's harder. And the other problem with programs is they typically are add-on programs. They're viewed as kind of an overload. So in times like this, when we have a funding crisis in the state, these are the first things that get cut. So counselors is a good example of it. Many people feel that counselors are an effective mechanism to address dropouts. Well, counselors cost money, and guess what is getting cut from school budgets right now are counselors. And lastly, we don't actually have that many examples of proven programs out there, which is a kind of sad commentary, but nonetheless, that's true. And this is true actually with a lot of things in education. We don't really know whether they're effective or not. So we have some examples, though, but we just have a limited number. The second approach is comprehensive solutions, which again is focused on the school level. It's more appropriate in schools that have a lot of dropouts, what some people call dropout factories, places where there's lots of kids dropping out. You wouldn't want to set up a program if most of the kids need help. So comprehensive or school-wide programs are better that way. The other advantage of them is that they can improve other outcomes besides dropout rates. So in other words, a good comprehensive school reform model will raise test scores and get more kids college ready and all those other things. So it does have the potential to have a greater impact than simply keeping kids from dropping out. Same disadvantages that we have with programs is we don't have a lot of models, and basically what it means is that it's really hard to change schools. So again, the Obama administration has an approach. We can maybe talk about its likelihood of being effective or not, but at least it's a school-wide view of trying to change schools. And lastly, there's the systemic approach, which also got advantages similar to what the school advantages are, which is it can affect more kids. So it's effective in areas that have a lot of dropouts, and it can target on dropout factories, and of course it can have more outcomes that way. But systemic solutions are also very hard to implement. And it involves more partners potentially, right? So in other words, if we want to spend money with community agencies or whatever, and if you look at the history of funding of these systemic solutions, state and federal governments as well as private foundations have literally invested billions of dollars. And I think the Ed Trust spokesperson will probably speak to that, but Ed Trust put out a very nice little brief recently talking about basically the failure of past attempts in California to implement systemic changes in schools through these major programs. So we don't have a good history here of having done this at the system level. So as I mentioned, we actually don't have a lot of examples of effective programs. The What Works Clearinghouse, which is an IES, U.S. Department of Education agency, reviews all the dropout and prevention programs, have done it. They did a report in September 2008 that looked at 84 studies of 22 programs, and only 23 studies had rigorous evidence that they could say whether the program worked or not. And if you look at those numbers, they're pretty sobering. They only found 7 programs that were effective in reducing dropout rates, 6 that were effective in improving progress towards graduation, 4 that were effective in improving completion rates, and 0 that were effective in improving graduation rates, partly because a lot of the evaluations didn't identify whether the programs were actually effective in getting kids to earn diplomas versus GEDs. And as you know, the federal government in particular is really pushing states basically to be accountable only for getting graduates to earn degrees, diplomas I should say, not GED certificates. So basically GEDs don't count in federal accountability. So we really need to know whether programs are effective in getting kids to earn regular diplomas as opposed to GEDs or competency diplomas. So I want to speak just briefly to this other report that I mentioned, which is this practice guide that the IES put out. And the reason for that is because the research is so thin on proven programs, is to actually broaden the scope of evidence that can guide policy and practice to say, even if we don't have as rigorous evidence about their effectiveness, what do we think are effective strategies that schools can use to address the problem? So what we did in this panel is we brought a series of experts together, reviewed the evidence, and then categorized the evidence as 3 levels: strong evidence, moderate evidence, and low evidence, basically based on our opinion. And with that kind of latitude, could this committee of experts come together and agree on what practices schools should adopt to looking at 3 things: whether the practices are effective in keeping kids to stay in school, that is, not to drop out; secondly, to progress in school, because it's not only sufficient to get a kid to not drop out. They actually have to learn something and pass classes. So the IES and this panel that we are on were asked to look at programs with respect to progress or progressing in school, that is, like promotion from 9th to 10th grade, and then finally completing school. So those are the outcomes that we looked at. And there's 6 recommendations that we came up with, and I'm just going to review them really briefly. One of them is that schools should use data systems to diagnose students who are likely to drop out. This is really what we call a diagnostic recommendation, because you wouldn't want to do this recommendation in the absence of doing other things, right? You wouldn't want to identify kids without having interventions that are targeting them. But in order to target them, the idea being that we should identify them. And that's this idea of early indicators, especially in middle school, but also in 9th grade, as being one of the places we might utilize data to identify at-risk kids. So the level of evidence on this recommendation was low because you wouldn't find any evaluations of this, again, as a standalone recommendation. It would only be a recommendation you'd do in conjunction. But just by way of example, one of the reports that we commissioned in LA showed the likelihood of graduating based on the number of classes that students fail in middle school and high school. And you can see just failing one class in either high school or middle school greatly reduced the odds of someone graduating. And in fact, in LA, middle school courses were more predictive than high school classes. So failing courses in middle school was more predictive of failing to graduate than failing a course in high school, which I thought was kind of interesting. Secondly, the recommendation is assign adult advocates to students. So this would be in the area of targeted intervention, where you identify at-risk kids and you assign them some kind of advocate. So when we looked at successful programs, we found a moderate level of evidence to support the idea that having some kind of adult advocate, mentor, person with a child who's at risk would help them stay in school. The third thing, then, the next 2 are kind of related to each other. One of them is to provide academic support and enrichment for these kids that are identified. Again, the level of evidence is moderate because there are a lot of programs that do this. So it may be after-school help, it may be tutoring, it may be a specific curriculum. Some programs have specific curricula for 9th graders in particular, because 9th graders often will walk into a high school at very low levels of math and literacy. So some programs have designed special curricula for these students. So the idea, again, would be to target that support to the kids that need it most. The fourth recommendation is to implement programs to improve students' classroom behavior and social skills. Now, this is less commonly found in interventions, and that's why the level of evidence is low. In other words, we don't have that many examples out there of programs that have actually provided classroom behavior and social skills training. One of the programs that did do this was one that I was involved with in the early 90s in LAUSD that targeted middle school kids, but there's a curriculum that my collaborator developed as a special ed teacher that actually taught kids social skills. And she now calls it a resilience training, but the idea being that you actually teach kids skills that they need to be successful in school, not just academic skills, but social skills. So, for example, kids that are prone to get in fights or to get verbally exchanges with teachers, or they can't behave themselves in the hallways, or whatever the case of that social behavior may be. The idea of this recommendation is to support kids' development in the social skill area, not just in the academic skill area. The fifth recommendation is to personalize the learning environment. So these two last recommendations are kind of the school level ones, which is to say in places where there are a lot of kids that are at risk to drop out, we can't just target the kids that are at risk if everybody's at risk. So the alternative to the other targeted programs is a school-wide approach, and one of them is to create personalized learning environments. And the most common way to do that is to break large comprehensive high schools into small learning communities or small independent schools, or maybe even pathways. That's one of the newest incarnations that the Irvine Foundation is pursuing in this linked learning project, so that students would somehow have an identity within a smaller group of teachers and kids within a larger school to create this personalization that helps to support their progress. And the last recommendation is the hardest probably, and that is to provide rigorous and relevant instruction to better engage students in learning. So this is the toughest nut to crack, as some people would say, which is how do we systematically improve instruction, especially at the high school level, but also at the middle school level, to better engage kids. And that's the rationale behind CTE as an approach, right? Especially CTE that's called multiple pathways. That is, can you take CTE courses that also meet A to G requirements of UC and CSU? And the answer is yes. And the UC system, for example, has certified, I think, over 16,000 CTE courses statewide that meet A to G requirements. So the idea behind multiple pathways is the idea that we can engage kids in maybe more relevant learning. But so that's the sixth recommendation. So the challenge, I think, moving forward, thinking about state policy, is choosing between strategies, which is what the IES practice guide talks about, and specific targeted programs, which have been shown to be effective, and school-wide programs. So which pathway do we choose here? And there's probably not a simple answer to that. I think it's important to think about strategies that are both effective and cost-effective. I haven't talked about costs at all, and we have even less research knowledge about costs, but there are some that suggest that investment in some of these programs really does pay off as an investment. The other issue that I haven't really spoken at in great detail is the idea of matching programs and strategy with local context. That in other words, some programs may be more appropriate in some places than others, depending on the population, depending on the resources that are available, depending on the existing capacity of schools. And lastly, I think it's really important to evaluate the outcomes of anything that's locally implemented, because it may work in one place and not another. So how am I doing for time? Do I have another 5 minutes? Okay. So let me now, I'm going to shift back to this, the policy dropout report that I mentioned, to talk about what its recommendations is as a kind of statewide strategy. And I won't go into detail, but I want to give kind of an overview of how this committee came down on this issue. So, and this is really the summary strategy, which is we think pressure is important, right, which is accountability is important, but we also think the committee also felt that support was important, so that the state can't just mandate that schools do X, Y, or Z without providing a support system for them to do that. So the accountability system, I think, helps. That's the pressure side. Provide more useful data. So we've had some bills in the last couple of years that have expanded the data system. CalPADS is up and running. We have now a requirement that the state will put out a dropout report. So I think all that is to the good. The harder one, however, is what we have not done, in my opinion, and that is really build support for schools, to build their capacity. And the idea of it was, when we met as a committee, the conclusion of the committee was, we don't want to just layer more programs on schools. That is not the way to address the dropout problem. The way to address the dropout problem is to more systematically and systemically improve the capacity of schools to just be better, Now, the programs might be part of that strategy, but the point is you just can't layer a program, especially on an incapable or even a dysfunctional school or district. So the idea of it was to think about strategies to improving the capacity of schools, and we also felt that it would improve not only student achievement, but other outcomes, dropouts and the like. And the last conclusion we have, which was that it isn't just a question of more money. It's a very common response in Sacramento and among legislators and policymakers and even educators, especially, I would say, to say the only way we can solve this is with more money. And I think money is clearly part of it, but it's not the only part of it. So I won't read you this, but it's in the handouts. But the idea is that in the past, and the Ed Trust brief highlights this as well, that the past programmatic efforts that we've had in the state have not been successful, and I don't think they'll be successful in the future. So let me just summarize really briefly the approach that the committee took, and it's in your handouts. And that is, we looked at the solution at kind of three levels, because the ultimate level of reform has to be the school, and the IES report that I just talked about focuses on school-level strategies. But in order for those strategies to be adopted effectively, then this district and the state needs to play a role. So I'm just going to summarize what these recommendations are, and we can talk about them more if you're interested. But so again, the first couple of them are about accountability and data. You know, we need better accountability, we need better data, and I think the state's moving in that direction. The last four, however, are much harder, and we haven't really done anything in that area. And that is, I think we need to create what we call high school reform standards, and we need to create some districts in the state who are going to implement them in high dropout areas. So it's the idea that says we don't necessarily have all the answers to this problem. We can't impose a statewide solution, but what we want to do is try to invest in innovations at the district level and through a consortium. So through the California Mayor's Roundtable and the Dropout Project, we actually put together an I-3 application. Unfortunately, it was unsuccessful in the state, that brought three school districts, San Bernardino, Alfred, and San Bernardino, together with two cities, the mayor's office in San Bernardino and the mayor's office in Riverside, and two UC campuses, UC Riverside and UC Santa Barbara, to put together a consortium and two outside providers of a school-level program and a targeted program who have been proven to be effective. And we created this partnership. As I said, unfortunately, it didn't work, but we basically tried to implement, and we'll want to implement, a kind of lighthouse district idea for dropouts. Now, I understand the second Race to the Top application from California is premised on the same notion of 7 large districts in the state developing teacher evaluation as a kind of focus. So this is the idea, saying the state, it's hard for the state, especially in the CDE with money being so tight, to do something kind of statewide, but what we want to do is foster innovation at a local level. So that's one of the recommendations in this report. In our report, we suggested the state could play a more proactive role, and I still believe they can play a more proactive role in creating these lighthouse districts. But I think there are other ways maybe of doing it as well. And then I'll mention just the last three, which is we need to work on middle schools just like we have to work on high schools. We need to make strategic investment in other programs and other strategies for reducing dropouts. For example, preschool programs that have been proven to work. And finally, I feel strongly about this. At some point in our future, we need to rethink about our high school graduation requirements. And specifically, I say that with respect to the non-cognitive areas of outcomes that we know are important in the job market. So there's a whole research literature that's been evolving over the last 10 years from economists, including Nobel economist James Heckman, that argues as important as cognitive skills are, math and science and things like that, to job performance and success in college, are a whole area of non-cognitive skills. Perseverance, sociability, being able to work with other people, you can think of what those are. And yet we don't encourage or reward schools or students for developing those skills. And yet, some people call them soft skills, by the way. But employers increasingly recognize them. And so, in my view, we should have a kind of broader conception of what high school graduation should look like. But right now, all we've focused on is academic requirements. So I won't go into this because I don't want to take any more time, but this is some examples of proven programs that have reduced dropout rates. Preschool programs, early childhood programs, class size reduction in K-12, in K-3 I should say, and even raising salaries. So this is kind of a cost-benefit ratio of proven programs that was taken from a national study that was done. And then districts have a role to play. Again, I won't go into this, but I think districts have to be a partner in this. And then ultimately, schools have to be where the action is. And the IES recommendations I mentioned talk about 6 strategies. These 4 strategies that we recommend are basically congruous with those 6 strategies. So I'm just going to leave it and saying the real challenge we have in moving forward is trying to think about how we ultimately affect kids and their engagement in schools from state level and federal levels, especially in this time of low budgets, not having any money. But also, we need a mechanism whereby we learn not just what to do, but how to do it well. So there was an interesting study that just came out the other day about after-school programs as an example. And what they found was after-school programs that were high quality had an effect. After-school programs that were medium or low quality had no effect. So it's like it says that if we can't do a program well, it's not worth doing at all because we're probably going to have no effect. So I think I'll leave it there and then hopefully have time to answer questions.
Well, thank you so much. And I do have some questions, but first I want to welcome Assemblymember Tom Torlakson and thank you for finding time to come. I did offer opening remarks to Assemblymember Bill Berryhill, so I thought if you have anything you wanted to add.
Madam Chair, I'm very glad to be here. Appreciate your keen focus on this challenging topic, and the presentations I know will enlighten us to a better way. You told me some of the things you're thinking of as a follow-up in the hearing, so I just want to commend you and support your work.
Thank you. I actually do want to get into some of the things that can lead us to action. One of the issues we've talked about before is that the California Department of Education doesn't really have a resource base to help school districts to figure out which programs are successful, which ones have proven to reduce dropouts, and how much money can be thrown at this problem and not solve anything if we're not careful. And I wondered if you could comment a bit on where you saw a role for the state in providing that support and resources to the local level.
Well, I think there is a role for the state to play. So let me, by way of example, talk about the way it's happened in the past with these high school, these past reform efforts, which is where money is made available to the districts to write an RFP or respond to an RFP or an RFA, and they write a proposal, and they either find a partner in advance or they find a partner afterwards. But in my view, and I don't want to be too critical because I don't know the details, but I don't think the state has been involved enough in this process. So in other words, what states are really good at doing is giving away money. And but as the past studies have shown, is they haven't been very successful in spending that money well. So what I would envision, this is what the Lighthouse District idea is all about, is for the state to be more proactive in setting out and identifying proven providers of programs so that, in other words, they can't just come up with anybody as a partner, as a kind of generalist. And I think this is particularly true with dropout prevention. In other words, there are some programs and some providers that have been proven to be effective in reducing dropout rates, and others might have expertise in other areas like reading or math curriculum or whatever the subject may be. But if the state were going to focus its attention on dropouts and graduation rates, it would look at providers of programs that have been targeted on those outcomes that have been proven to work, then only give the money to districts that are willing to adopt those programs, in a collaborative way. And of course, my research bias would say there should be a research partner from the very beginning in this to study this process so that we can learn from it. So I think the chances of a successful outcome will be better if the state was more proactive in the first place of matching providers of proven programs to districts that need support. See, and here's one of the differences, I think, is some districts that are very have a lot of capacity at the district level and have very good superintendents at the district level, and we know some of what they are, probably need less state help than the districts that are struggling more and the schools that are struggling more. So I think the role, and this is the argument that people have made to the state already, which is if a district has already proven itself to be effective with producing successful outcomes or good outcomes for kids, including graduation rates, then maybe the state should back off and give them more waivers or flexibility or whatever, and that's, I know, a theme that the governor has endorsed. But the schools that don't have it together, the districts that don't have it together, that's where I think the state should have a more proactive role. In other words, maybe the argument would be the districts that are doing a good job, leave them alone, and that's even what they'd probably say to the state. But the districts that aren't doing a good job need the proactive involvement of the state. So that's where I think the difference would be, and the CDE could be more proactive in matching program providers with the needs of these districts and put in programs that have a record somewhere else, and then we evaluate them and see if they're working there, and if they work there, then we expand them.
Is that member Berryhill?
So you would, the state would develop some kind of a criteria of a certain level of, if your dropout rate is above and beyond this, we got to come in and help you develop
and
best
over
practices.
some period of time or something, so, you know,
Right.
because the dropout statistics can be very unstable for 1 year, and our data system is close to having a good longitudinal rate, but anyway, there's a lot of problems with the rates that we have. But I think we can do a reasonable job of finding school districts that need help. I mean, right now, in the Race to the Top application, as some of you may know, we had this dropout factory criteria is technically a 60% dropout rate. Well, hardly any school in California met that rate because we have this inflated rate that says everybody's wonderful. So hardly any schools fell into this category of a dropout factory, but we know, in fact, there are schools that have really high dropout rates. So anyway, I think we have enough good data, sufficient data to identify those schools.
If you just focus on the worst 10%.
Yeah, and I think also, for example, we know they tend to be concentrated in certain districts, larger ones.
And that's what I wanted to ask is do you, I didn't see anything in the studies on demographics and their relation to the dropout rate. Is there a correlation with higher, say, free and reduced lunch rate school districts?
Poverty is
Yeah,
underlies a lot of
exactly.
it. Yeah.
And so a lot of those communities oftentimes have migrant workers. They're moving from town to town, and that's got to have a huge impact on the ability to keep their kids in a school.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that's a huge problem. It's an issue. Mobility in general is an issue. But there is this distinction between what we call preventable mobility and unpreventable mobility. So when parents lose somebody loses their job and has to move,
right.
The schools can't do much about it. But some mobility has been proven to be a result of active or even incidental policies of schools and districts to not, in other words, if schools were better, there would be less mobility, or if districts were better, there'd be less mobility. So I think the mobility is something that has to be addressed, but it's not an excuse for not doing programs. So we have to put that into, you have to factor mobility into the equation, but it doesn't have to be a detriment to moving forward.
And as far as the state and what the state can do, I know CSBA works, with districts and has a lot of great programs. And as a school board member, we picked up a lot of great information just from, within our. But if the state focused on the worst 10% or whatever that number would be, that might make some sense.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what, of course, the SIG funding is. The current administration is trying to target the bottom group. So the state, there is a concerted effort now to focus on that.
Let me play devil's advocate a little bit on the state role of, say, certifying different providers that have proven successful so that we know that we're not wasting money, but we're actually duplicating models that are going to have results. What I think the counter argument to that is when you have a local community that actually rallies around and wants to do something, but they don't have a certified provider that's willing to go into that area, but they still want to do it, then they miss out on kind of the state support side of it, even though there may be a lot of good-intentioned people in that community that really do want to do something to address their local issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a problem, but I don't foresee it being a problem. I mean, I know a couple of the providers, not just the ones that I tried to work with for our application, but even some other ones. And, I mean, I've never heard of ones, and they typically will work in very high poverty districts and high disadvantaged districts. So there isn't a record of that problem existing. I'm not saying it couldn't exist, whereby a provider would say, I can't work here. I think there is a potential problem, though, of instability at the district level, right? I mean, we have districts that have high turnover of superintendents. We have, maybe poor union relationships and or school board relationships. So, and here's what, and the research talks about that, by the way, and it's a little sobering because if there's kind of instability at the district level or even dysfunctionality at the district level, it makes putting this stuff in really hard. So I'm not sure there's a simple answer to that, but when I've talked to providers about this situation, the way they try to deal with it is to structure at the district level a management structure for ensuring that this work will be carried on no matter what happens in the rest of the district, so to speak. So I'm not saying it's easy to do it, but I think there's ways to try to address some of those difficulties such that I don't think providers would be scared away from working with districts. And even if you just said the state will try this out, I mean, this is, again, the idea behind Race to the Top now, which is let's get some willing districts. That's what I did with the 3 that I was able to recruit, partly through the Mayor's Roundtable, to say, are you guys willing to try this? And the mayor's offices were actually really great in this, by the way, as well as the districts, and saying, God, this is a partnership, let's try it. And that's really what it was, let's try it, So that's the mentality I think that the state could play, is fostering these kind of, well, I use the term lighthouse districts, but fostering these kind of innovation zones, some people might want to call it that or something, but where we're trying some things. We're not going to impose it statewide because we don't know that it works yet. But we're going to try some things, and whether it's on dropouts or English learners or the Race to the Top is on teacher evaluation, whatever the topic may be, we have innovation kind of going on in the state, right? We want to foster innovation. How much the state can honestly do about that, I don't know, because they obviously have to have capacity too. And there's, I think it's fairly well documented in a lot of states like California. Our CDE capacity has been decimated by budget cuts too, right? So how much expertise do they have? So that's a hard question to answer, because I think without the capacity at the state level, the state can't do the things that I'm saying it probably should do. So it is a problem.
Yeah, go ahead.
The average lifespan for a superintendent in school district is what, 2.5 years?
Something, and large urban ones, yeah. Right. It is a problem. Yeah. And you look at some very successful districts in our state that have long-standing superintendents, and it's not an accident. Right? So it is. And those are problems that I think the state has a harder time dealing with, frankly. If there's instability on a school board or at a superintendent's office. But I think we can't use that as an excuse. I think we have to at least try to structure relationships with outside providers, with research organizations to foster this stuff in districts that need the help despite that. Otherwise, we're just not going to help them, right? And that's not going to solve the problem. So the one thing I didn't mention, by the way, that's underlying a lot of this idea of focusing on the bottom 5% is we know the dropout problem is a concentrated problem, right? We know it's stronger in some schools than others. It's stronger in some districts than others. So the state doesn't have to actually take a statewide approach in that sense. Targeting the places of highest need is going to yield the best impact in the state anyway. So working in LAUSD, obviously, but also working in places like San Bernardino and others that have multiple schools with high dropout rates could reap really great benefits, I think, for the state.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and I hope that you'll stick around to the end of the hearing, because I think we'll have more questions after we have additional presenters. But I want to invite up Ursula Bischoff, if I pronounced that correctly, sorry, from West Ed, and also Mayor Ann Johnson, who I'll have speak next. But both have been working with the Mayor's Education Roundtable, and the Mayor's Education Roundtable has been working with cities and partnering them with superintendents in the counties and developing a statewide action plan to help cities do what's necessary to help their schools and communities. So welcome, Ursula.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Huber, Assemblymember Berryhill. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the Mayor's Education Roundtable, which I'll just refer to as the MRT for short. We're funded by the James Irvine Foundation, and we convene mayors from 18 of California's larger cities, along with their district superintendents, key staff, and community members to share data, evidence-based practices, and programmatic strategies to help improve graduation rates. The MRT also facilitates opportunities for mayors to develop common ground and engage in collective work on statewide education policy and legislative initiatives. Specifically, the MRT focuses its work in 3 areas. One is state policy, building and strengthening relationships with legislative leaders, building strategic partnerships with national, statewide, and local organizations, developing policy analyses, and advocating for legislation to help improve outcomes for students. Local action to provide technical assistance to our members to help them build political will and cross-sector community engagement to establish education agendas, think about planning and implementing local practices, promising practices, evidence-based practices, and approaches to improving outcomes. and building a resource network. We serve as a portal to information for our members, building a library of research and policy analyses on best practices like the IES practice guide Dr. Rumberger referenced, and also working with him and other experts to produce data and information that will help inform their practice at the local levels. This past April, the MRT convened the California Mayor's Graduation Summit. We had support from the America's Promise Alliance, State Farm Insurance Company, and AT&T, which are partners in this national effort to improve graduation rates. Mayors assembled teams, including their district superintendents, members of the city council and school board, business and civic leaders, and youth, to learn about and develop approaches to increasing rates of graduation, career entry, and enrollment in post-secondary education. Mayors and their superintendents had the opportunity to meet with Senate Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg to discuss pending legislation, and he requested that our members send him their recommendations for policy action later this year. In addition, the mayors addressed the Assembly and the media, and several of our member cities presented strategies they're currently implementing to build partnerships and create career-relevant opportunities for youth to succeed in school. City teams then met to form and refine the plans that they're implementing at the local level. After reviewing the city's local plans, the MRT produced a statewide plan, which is included in your materials. And this plan has a 7-point agenda. It's a set of strategies that are common to all of our member cities for action to turn around the dropout rate. And the strategies that they've selected really reflect a lot of the content Dr. Rumberger just reviewed with you. The first is implementing relevant, rigorous, and personalized learning opportunities through linked learning options or multiple pathways programs to offer career technical instruction in defined career pathways. Several of our member cities have already implemented successful linked learning models, and others are in the process of developing these. They also are working to promote youth involvement and youth voice in resolving these issues. Many want to tap existing youth councils and provide strategies that more fully and meaningfully engaged youth in providing those positive peer supports that will help their peers stay in school. They also want to promote parent engagement in resolving these issues. Members expressed interest in learning more about parents' rights and obligations with respect to their children's education, and want to tap existing parent resource groups to help them focus on this issue and build their capacity to support their children and youth. A lot will be working on developing early warning identification and response systems. Several of our member cities have implemented truancy prevention and recovery strategies, including daytime curfews and truancy recovery centers in collaboration with social services and police departments. The MRT will encourage our members to share information about and evaluate the programs that they have in place so we can establish some best practices. We're also advocating making better use of data. As Dr. Rumberger mentioned, there are a lot of issues with respect to how we measure graduation and dropout rates. Our member cities have agreed that while some of these technical issues are being resolved and adopted in a statewide discussion, we would choose a set of measures among ourselves that we would adhere to so that we could measure the success of our efforts under this plan. They also want to be more informed consumers of data. So we will provide technical assistance in helping them understand, well, what really goes into calculating these rates, how they can get the data, and how to use it. The sixth point in our plan is intensifying and broadening community investment in action on this issue. We know that a lot of the strategies require long-term commitments of support from many different partners at local and state levels. And so our members are going to be focusing in particular on engaging the business community in helping to create local economic environment that actually provides incentives for youth to stay in school. Probably the most significant and one of the most immediate and important things that we'll be doing is developing a policy analysis, a policy scan that is looking ultimately to generate recommendations for policy action. West Ed is home to the Regional Education Laboratory West, and we are conducting a policy scan to see how state education policies operate either to promote or inhibit graduation. The mayor's advisors have helped us to identify priority issues to include in the scan, and they will include, among others, the exit exam, regulations that affect vulnerable youth, foster youth, homeless youth, youth with disabilities, including partial credit, credit recovery, and regulations affecting overage students, referrals or assignment to alternative schools, referrals to GED programs, immigration issues, flexible funding and funding resources, and data. The MRT will forward recommendations from this scan to Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg and to this committee for discussion and possible legislative action. Members of this committee and the Assembly can help in these ways. You can really help keep a focus on this issue and establish a sense of urgency around it. Like our mayors and, as Russ mentioned, like our president, as public leaders, you're in a position to help influence the media and bring partners together and train attention on this issue. You can be available to meet with our member cities to consider their policy and legislative recommendations and talk with them about their experience on the ground. Continue to ask hard questions. Let us know what information would be helpful to you. As Russ said, we have a lot of information that helps define the problem, not so much on what works to resolve it. If there's something in particular you'd like to know, let us know. Sponsor or support legislation that can provide financial incentives for businesses that offer educational and employment opportunities for youth and help them to create economic and employment conditions in our cities that will provide incentives for youth to remain in school and move into careers and post-secondary programs in their hometowns. You can also advocate for improved data systems for education and integrated data systems across education and the social and health services. This is happening at the local level and very successfully in many respects. Education is not always included in these data integration efforts, and it would be wonderful to see more cooperation between the systems that serve youth and families and the education system.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about that, you mean more of people who are on other programs that are also in at-risk identifiable
We're serving
clusters.
The same children and youth. Help us to think more creatively about how we can leverage private funding more effectively. We're funded by foundations. We have a lot of partners in the private sector. There are business people who are very interested and have a huge investment in making sure our youth graduate qualified to enter into careers. Think about how to work with them more proactively to bring partners to the table, as Russ was suggesting, by seeding demonstration projects or by thinking about how you allocate discretionary funding or resources through the agencies to foster development of programs in certain areas that address certain topics. Our philanthropic partners think that there really is a lesson to be learned from the federal government's approach to offering competitive grants for some of its major funding allocations requiring a private match. It's really done a lot to bring people to the table and get them thinking about working together. Even if you don't win the competition, you've still got your resource base together, and there are opportunities for action and productive progress. You can think about opportunities to target, in the same way, target and preserve funding for social services that support children, youth, and families, because as Russ said, it's not an academic issue alone. I have a long history of working with youth in foster care, and if they can't concentrate in school because of all the other things happening in their lives, and they don't have support for all the other things happening in their lives, they won't be able to succeed in school. And you can even create opportunities yourselves to engage youth in this type of a process. At West Ed, we very successfully engaged youth in statewide regional dialogues. We've worked in other states with members of their legislatures to involve youth in discussions like the one today. So think about ways that you can actually bring youth voice to a process like this.
Yeah, I think you probably missed our previous hearings where we had students come in and testify about the impact of various programs that we were highlighting in this committee and how it affected their lives. So thank you for those recommendations, and we'll look forward to receiving the policy recommendations that'll be coming out of the Mayor's Roundtable. But I would like to turn now to the Honorable Ann Johnston, from the Mayor of Stockton, who's participated in the Roundtable, and she can describe more what Stockton City's plan of action is.
Thank you, Assembly Member. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I am the on-the-ground mayor who's trying to do something in my city. And as you all know, Stockton is one of the leading cities that has a huge dropout problem, and as was estimated, it's probably 35% of our students don't finish high school with that diploma. And for those of you who don't know, I was on the Lodi School Board for 13 years prior to getting elected to the Stockton City Council and then becoming mayor. And education, I believe personally, is the key to economic recovery and growth in any community. And so if you don't have a strong educational school system, you can't hope to compete, you can't hope to bring in the businesses, you can't hope to improve your community's environment or quality of life, that it all revolves around schools and the educational setting. So that's why I'm very much an education mayor, if there is such a thing. And I began, even before I took office, going to the Mayor's Roundtable in San Francisco with then Superintendent Tony Amato from Stockton Unified School District. And as you know, the city of Stockton has 4 school districts that it serves. Stockton being the largest, and of course the focus of the research that's been done on dropouts, because at one point Stockton Unified was called the Dropout Factory, even though not 65% dropout, it's just the reverse. Nevertheless, there's a huge number of young people that don't finish school in Stockton. So Superintendent Amato and I went to the round table, and he and I were focused on the partnership that could occur between the school district, Stockton Unified, and the city of Stockton. Well, Superintendent Amato left the district. We are now with our 3rd superintendent in 18 months. And so, you know, I as mayor have been attempting to deal with the succession of superintendents. However, fortunately, there's good support staff, there's good deputy superintendents, there's folks who actually do stuff in the district. And so I'm working with them to further the goals of the Education Roundtable. Stockton received an America's Promise grant in 2008 to have a summit about educational outcomes in our community. And we put that together in 2009. We received $10,000. In October of last year, a little less than a year ago, we brought together 200 community members for a Saturday daytime event that occurred at the Hilton Hotel in Stockton. We had representatives of the educational establishment, the businesses, the clergy, the faith-based, the nonprofit groups, the neighborhood groups, and students. We had everyone there in the room. We spent 6 hours one Saturday talking about education and what is important in the city. We had several presenters. Then we had Dr. Matt Wettstein from Delta College, who talked about the statistics, the reasons for dropping out, and the community's ability to respond. And I won't go into any of that. Most of the data you already know. It's poverty, it's lack of education, it's truancy, it's crime, it's neighborhood issues, you name it, and it's all there, all those support things that young people need. Mike Locke, the CEO and president of the Partnership and Business Council in San Joaquin County, probably gave one of the most dramatic presentations in terms of what having so many young people drop out means to the economics of San Joaquin County. And he talked about several companies that had attempted or wanted to locate in Stockton, and we came down to being one of 2 choices. It turns out that it was the Federated Group was looking at either Phoenix, Arizona, or Stockton, California, to locate a distribution center that employed 500 workers, a good salary, good benefits. It turns out they chose Phoenix because of our rough workforce. That's what they called it, a rough workforce. And they cited the lack of education in general, the lack of young people not graduating from high school, the crime in our community. They saw it as a rough workforce. They knew that there was gang issues in the city, but it was the education of our young people and our overall population that turned them off. So they left. So he talked about how we lose business, we lose industry because they look at those quality of life issues, education being top of the list. And I believe that education takes, if you have a good education system, you take care of crime, you take care of jobs, you take care of all those other things that communities struggle with. So then we had Dr. Norton Grubb from UC Berkeley who talked about civic capacity and what schools and all of these agencies could do to come together. And he had some very innovative ideas and certainly knows his subject matter and gave us some food for thought. Following that summit, we formed subcommittees, and we have four of them to date. We're actively engaged in this. We have a mentoring subcommittee that's developing a Mentoring is Cool campaign where we number one, bring all the mentoring activities that are happening in the city together under one umbrella so we know what the resources are out there. And then we start working with the school district, linking up the kids who need mentoring with these agencies. And so Stockton Unified is out there really working on that. The tutoring and the parenting are not as far along. Again, we're developing comprehensive databases of who does what where, because what we found is there's a lot of fragmented efforts in our community, probably in every community. And, somebody's doing this here, a church is doing this there. They're all toward the same goal, but they're not working. They don't know about each other. And so it looks like nothing is happening. So we want to bring them all under the same tent. We want to get them focused and working together and sharing resources, especially in this time of economic recession. So that's the piece with tutoring and parenting. And literacy, I'm leading an effort called the Mayor's Book Club because I believe, based upon the statistics you saw, one of the key times to influence young people is preschool 4-year-olds. If you can get books into their hands, if you can get parents to read to them, if you can get them thinking about that reading or the vocabulary building that is required for reading, you've gotten them a long way toward having them ready for school. And that's really what the goal is, to help children be ready for school. So, I'm going out and talking to preschool groups, going out to daycare centers, going out to schools with Head Starts, going out and reading to children at 3 and 4 years old. And there have been some taping sessions where we run it on our public broadcast channel where you engage the children and the parents in reading. So I've been doing that personally. And got great cooperation with the school district and all the social service agencies out there. Some of the other things, and one of the things that we're doing in Stockton, you've probably heard of, is Operation Peacekeeper, and that's been an ongoing thing where former gang members are working within the schools to identify young people that are moving toward the gang lifestyle. They started out about 3 years ago working strictly at the high school level, and now they've recognized that they need to focus just as much on the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade level. So they're working in elementary schools as well. We also have a chaplaincy program, the largest in the county. We have, actually in the nation, we have 40 police chaplains who serve as counselors and helpers out in our elementary and high schools. They come out and they act as friends, act as counselors. There's no proselytizing. They go in and they work with young people and help them and present programs, all on a voluntary basis. And that was developed out of our police program. So that's a super program. Some of the quick things that I'm doing, one of the things Stockton Unified is really focusing on this year is attendance at school. Making sure the kids are in school, because we know if they have so many absences, the percentages of them dropping out are increased substantially. So they're working on attendance, and so every school has an attendance program outlined that they're going to keep kids in school, follow up on those who don't come. I'm going to give an annual Mayor Star Award to the school that has the most improved attendance percentage-wise. I want them to go from 92% to 98 or 99% attendance. So I'm going to be doing that. Prior to school beginning, May 27th, I hosted a breakfast with the principals. I invited all the Stockton Unified principals to have breakfast with me, and I talked about their leadership role, how we would support them, what we could do, and that was kind of a good kickoff to let them know that I was on their side, working with them, because their role was so critical in our community. The superintendent and I did a recorded message 3 days before school started out to every family in Stockton Unified, a joint message saying, we want you in school. It's important that you're there. It's so critical. And that was received very well. It was sent out twice prior to school starting. So that was important. We have a program we're doing called Caught You in Class, where one of the local radio personalities and I are going to go out and recognize young people who have improved their attendance in school. Go out and surprise them by coming out and giving them a certificate, small rewards from businesses, that kind of thing. And I've already gone to several schools and talked about the program and encouraged them to improve their attendance because I want to come out and catch them in class. So there's that part of it. We have an ongoing program called Adopt a School, where we have local businesses actually adopt schools and take on projects within the schools, mostly the very needy schools, but some, that are not so needy. And that's been very successful, and we continue to build on that. We're also planning, the superintendent and I, to send out, again, recorded message to chronic truants, those who are not coming to school. We're going to remind them, guess what? You've gotten 2 letters from the district. We want you in class. We expect you in class. I'm going to come out and see if you're in class. So that's all part of that truancy, trying to improve the attendance and reduce the truancy, because we have the numbers are staggering in terms of students who are not coming to school. On the first day of school, there were 3,000 short in Stockton Unified School District of kids they had on the books. They've improved that in the last 2 weeks. Now they're about 1,500 students short. But Stockton Unified is out there calling parents, going out and making home visits. They've made a very concerted effort to identify and pull those kids back in or find out if they've gone to another school district so that they can focus on those who are not showing up. So, I'm happy to report these things are happening in Stockton. They may not seem like much, but it's chipping away. It's chipping away at the old block and trying to make improvements on, as you can within a school district that has significant challenges, high poverty, high crime, high unemployment, high foreclosures. So we have an uphill battle, but I'm out there as the mayor saying education is critical, telling the business community how important their support is of our schools, and saying it is a community issue. It's not just a schools issue, it's a community issue. And unless we come together as a community, we're never going to make that leap forward that we need to make to be really an economic engine in our area. So what can the state do? Get out of the good schools' way. Let the good schools do their good jobs. And again, help those poor performing schools without further mandates, without layering more stuff on them, with giving them some latitude to use categorical funds in ways that you don't think they should use or somebody doesn't think they should use. Reduce the ed code requirements. I mean, as a school board member, I know how tall the ed code is, how ridiculous it is. When you look at other states, there's way too many rules and regulations on schools. Let teachers do their jobs, let them be in the classroom and do what they do best, but provide them the support, because what we heard from students in our summit was teachers don't care about us, they're too busy, we're just a number, we're just a name. We're not validated, we're not recognized. When we need help, we're not getting help. So, those are the kinds of things we heard from students. So, long story short, if the state obviously could, approve more budgeting. One of the district superintendents in Stockton said, if you could give more money to truancy courts. Truancy courts really at one time were in existence in our community, where judges talk to truant kids and their parents. And that made a huge difference in what happened after that. Just like we have drug courts now that really help addicted folks get through difficult times, truancy court is another tool in the toolbox for making parents accountable and students accountable. So that's just a thought that I throw out. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Assemblymember Torlakson.
Well, it's great to have an educator here. You can tell the positive optimism and high energy of a teacher in you, and school board member and now mayor. And I had the chance to meet with Mayor Johnson in Stockton to just hear firsthand some of these programs. So I was just totally impressed with the hands-on total involvement that you've taken as mayor, and appreciate all the types of programs here, which I think could be replicated as best practices and then disseminated around the state. I wanted to ask you just two questions about your recorded phone message. Again, is a really interesting way to reach parents. How about, have you had any luck with TV or radio, like doing joint PSAs? You'd think that...
No, that's next on the list.
That's
We're
next on
actually
the list.
developing that. That grew out of the recorded phone
Yeah,
messages.
it's such a nice
Yep.
idea that you're side by side, the superintendent, the leader of the city, the civic side of Stockton. And then the Adopt a School program, what does that involve? If a local business in your community wants to adopt a school, what are the details of how they what they offer?
Well, we really let them tailor their adoption to the school. And generally, we suggest if a business is interested, usually they have their eye on a particular school because they have employees whose children go to that school, they have some connection, or it's a neighborhood school. So we ask the business folks to go in and talk to the principal and see what the principal needs at the school. Sometimes it's incentives for attendance. Sometimes it's book bags so that every child has something to take their equipment home. Sometimes it's giving curriculum. And I will give you an example. San Joaquin County Office of Ed partnered with Hamilton School to develop a health careers curriculum. And the partners there are Kaiser Permanente, Dameron Hospital, St. Joe's, San Joaquin County Hospital. And those professionals worked with the school staff to develop a health curriculum whereby what these businesses have committed, and remember, these are healthcare professionals whose trained workforce is key to their success, key to their survival. They wanted to be able to help with the curricular aspects. So what they have committed to is coming in 1 day a week at a particular grade level for 5 years and doing curriculum on science or math or health. For instance, Kaiser Permanente brought a doctor in 4th grade during February, the Heart Month, and they brought an actual pig heart or some kind of heart. They did the whole curriculum there with this 4th grade class. So they adopt the business, in this case at Hamilton. I think Kaiser has 4th grade, Dameron has 5th grade, St. Joe's has 6th grade, and then they go up 7th and 8th. So they actually have 5 partners at that school. So they take that grade level and they work that curriculum through. And they're actually following those groups of kids then through their elementary school. But that's been wildly successful in that it's brought the parents into the school because now they're getting health education that these providers provide after school. You know, they come in, they do health fairs, they do nutritional things. There's lots of spin-offs. In fact, it's so competitive. You know, they have the flags of the 5 hospitals flying outside the school, and they fight for which gets the highest place on the flagpole. But that's just one example of really in the extreme how businesses have taken on a school. In other schools, it's been developing an engineering curriculum for 7th and 8th graders. It's very individual, very unique, and all we do is promote the idea and tell them who to get in contact with. There's no financial support. It's simply saying, businesses, your investment in the schools is going to pay off big time.
Well, I just commend you as mayor for the leadership, and these kind of vibrant partnerships with the community and comprehensive approaches are, I think, a key to helping the schools address the dropout rate. So the students of Stockton are very lucky.
We have a long way to go.
Senator Berryhill.
Yeah, Mayor Johnson, I also commend you for your enthusiasm and your interest in the schools and the community. Does the rest of the council share your enthusiasm, and do they get themselves involved with the schools?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
yet.
Well,
Frankly, I mean, they're enthusiastic. I mean, they share the concept of working, but I've yet to be able to get them directly involved, but they need to be.
They do. And one of the things that, in my time on the school board, that I learned was that how little collaboration occurs between a lot of districts and their communities. And in Ceres, we started having quarterly meetings with the council. It was hard to get everybody from the boards and the council there, so we made it 2+2. So 2 from the council, 2 from the board. We're dedicated to meeting quarterly and collaborating on, ways we could, especially when times are tough, that you can collaborate and maybe use each other's services to try to save some money. And so that was something that worked very well. Another thing that we did in my district that I think had, you talk about spinoff and stuff, all of our administrators are encouraged, and I think we actually paid their dues to be involved with community organizations, whether it was Lions or Optimists or any of these, and that really connects them to the business community and so forth. So, but yeah, keep the pressure on the.
Thank you for bringing up the 2x2 concept, because in fact we do that. That's how council members are involved. The two council members representing, like Lodi Unified, they meet with 2 school board members and staff on a regular basis. So it is like every quarter. Sometimes it's monthly, depending upon what
How much
areas.
is going on.
And that's been going on for probably 8 or 10 years
good.
now.
Good. Well, very good.
So I apologize. I had forgotten that is an ongoing thing that we do.
Thank you. I also want to thank you. We did have Superintendent Tony Amata here in our first hearing to talk a lot about what was happening in bringing those community resources together, and it made dramatic differences in the numbers in a short period of time. I think the true test for Stockton is whether or not that trend is going to continue, and whether with the turnover that you've had, if those pressures are just going to unravel the progress that we have. And from a state perspective, I think that that's something that we're looking at, because if we're going to invest in these dropout strategies, not only do we want to make sure that they've been proven to actually reduce the dropout rate, but that they're sustainable, and that they're not things where we go in and we just fix the problem for a year or two and then it's right back again. So I really appreciate your talking about all the other efforts that are going on, and I think that we'll be watching that data carefully, and really commend you for trying to get some action on the ground.
Thank you. Well, that's my challenge, is the sustainability of any program we put together with the school district, because as mayors change, as superintendents change, and elected officials change, it can all go away. So that's going to be probably the hardest part of all this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So our last presenter, and then we'll take public comment also. So if you have something to chime into on these presentations that we're hearing, we'll welcome public comment. But Arun, now I'm going to butcher how to say your last name too. Ramanathan of the Education Trust West is here to offer their recommendations.
All right, thank you very much. If you just give me a few moments, let me pull up my PowerPoint. Thank you for your time this afternoon, Chairwoman and Assemblyman Berryhill.
And I may ask you to pull one of those microphones pretty close, because while we're not live right now, we're replaying this at 6 o'clock tonight. So
all right.
You can all watch from home.
So my name is Arun Ramanathan. I'm the Executive Director of the Education Trust West, and I'm sorry for doing a PowerPoint, but I will go through it fairly quickly. And the main reason that I'm bringing up PowerPoint with me is primarily to make some points, both about California's demographics and how that is intersecting with the dropout crisis, and then lead into what really is the point of this briefing, which is some of the solutions that we at the Ed Trust West believe are critical to addressing the dropout crisis. So let me start off with California's demographics, and I note that I'm batting cleanup here after 4 hearings, so this might be particularly relevant, but I think what always strikes me when I see this particular chart is how much our demographics have changed and how different our demographics often are from those of other states, and why issues such as the dropout crisis as a result are particularly relevant. In California, if you combine the 49% of Latinos with the 7% African American population, the 8% Asian population, and the 6% others, what you're basically seeing is a shift in our student population where we're roughly almost 3/4 majority minority at this point. And that is a very interesting shift for our nation, but when you look at who the dropout rate particularly impacts, it's both the African American and Latino population in particular. I think 2 other relevant aspects of the California state population that I always try to bring up. One is that we have 3 million Latino students in this state. By themselves, we have more Latino students than 48 other states have students in total, which is a remarkable statistic. We have 1.3 million English learners in that state. That's more English learners than 39 states have students. So again, you talk about 2 populations where the dropout rate is particularly relevant and 2 communities where it's relevant. I think one other point I always try to make when I look at this chart is that the diversity of California's population is often expressed as a negative, particularly by long-term educators, of which I am one. I like to see it as a great positive and a potential strength for our state. So, given the population, given who our student population is, we do know some things about high school dropouts. Some very basic facts. They're more likely to be poor. Over half of our student population are students in poverty. They're more likely to be male, and they're more likely to be students of color. I'd also argue that they're more likely to be students with disabilities. I used to direct a special education program in a large urban school district, and they're more likely to be English learners. If you look at the breakdown between the various demographics in California, I mean, this is just the graduation rate. We've heard about this before. We know that the dropout crisis is impacting African American and Latino students at a particularly high rate. But as a percentage, overall, it's not so good for our state at 68%, to have 68% of our students graduating. But even for Asians and white students, there are dropouts, and we do have to pay attention across the board to any student that's not graduating from high school. Now, one particular point that I think is very important to bring up is that the roots of the dropout crisis, and Mr. Rumberger pointed this out quite well, do not start in high school. They start well before high school. And the main reason that I'm pointing this out with this chart and with this slide is that on the right-hand side you can see the achievement gaps between white students and African American students. And you can also see that they basically stay fairly consistent in the elementary grades. At some point they increase in 8th grade and 11th grade in English language arts. But on the English language arts side, I think one thing that needs to be consistently brought up and consistently explored is the fact that reading instruction often stops in the 4th grade. And that the reading, in particular, is the way the children access the curriculum, particularly the more complex curriculum, once they reach high school. There used to be in this state and in this nation a huge focus on reading instruction, particularly for English learners and at the elementary level. But much of that has disappeared. It's something that we'd like to see come back again, a focus, but not just at the early grades, but a focus throughout the grades so that students can access the curriculum. I think the second thing that you can see with the achievement gaps is that they're basically the same for Latinos and African Americans once you start looking at math in the high school level. What happens is the gaps themselves often decrease, but what you also see is that student performance for white students is decreasing too. So essentially what's happening is for African American and Latino students, by the time they get into high school, their performance is quite poor. In Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 in the end of course exams, only about 25% are passing Algebra 2 at the proficient or advanced rate, and only 1 in 5 are passing Algebra 1. But for white students, the numbers aren't all that great either. So what we're talking about is both a crisis in terms of dropouts, but a crisis in terms of consistently declining performance. And the next couple of charts basically show that for African American and Latino students across the board. You have a high point, which from our perspective is still unacceptable, in 4th grade of 50%, 1 in 2 who are proficient. But by the time you get into 11th grade, 1 in 4 is proficient in English language arts for African American students. For Latino proficiency, the same declines. You start with a high point in 4th grade, and then you decline all the way down in 11th grade, down to about 1 in 4. So the roots of the dropout crisis don't happen, again, at the high school level. They don't happen at the middle school level, but they happen in terms of the quality of instruction received by students all the way through the grades. And then there's something happening that's causing a consistent drop in performance by the time they reach 9th grade. Now, we believe that the roots and the sources are quite basic. One of them is inequitable access to high-quality neighborhood schools. We just completed a brief where we took a look at Latino and African American students and their access to the schools in the bottom 3 deciles versus the top 3 deciles. Well, for African American students, they're 6 times more likely to attend a school in the bottom 3 deciles than a white student. So there's serious lack of access to high-quality schools in neighborhoods that are heavily African American, heavily Latino, heavily English learner. And that, I think, is an issue that needs to be addressed in combination with addressing the dropout crisis. It's a larger systemic issue, and I think Dr. Rumberger pointed that out quite well. Inequitable access to effective teachers. We've had a lot of the commentators point out that one thing the students see is that their teachers aren't necessarily interested in them or interested in their progress. I would say, that's probably not the case across the board. There are great teachers. There are wonderful teachers who are accessing our students' interests. There's wonderful programs. But we as a state don't systematically assess how our teachers are doing. In the state, you can do a performance evaluation in some districts once every 4 years. And we feel that it's very important to be able to identify who your most effective teachers are and use your most effective teachers as a school reform strategy. If you are able to redistribute them at the high school, at the school level, at the district level, I think you'd find that student performance would also increase at the same time. And the last aspect, and again, Dr. Rumberger pointed this out, a lack of rigor and low expectations for our neediest students. This is consistent work that the Ed Trust West has done over the years. But, what we're seeing is, and we've run this data in many, many different school districts and across the state, is that very few students, African American, Latino students, are graduating with the ability to attend a four-year college or university in California. Now, granted, many students are not graduating at all from our high schools. But the question, and we often get this push and pull between career and technical education and high expectations for students. And I don't necessarily believe that should be the case. We can find ways, and many districts have found ways to combine the two. But at the same time, we have to remember that our students, on average, are going to change their jobs 5 or 6 times during the course of their careers, sometimes many more times. That's the case now for most kids. So teaching them a distinct set of skills with the expectation that they are going to carry those skills into the future is not realistic. Now, again, these are just some basic numbers. The number of dropouts for African American students, the number of dropouts for Latino students versus the number enrolled in the California State University system. We actually tried to get the numbers for the prison system to put them up there too, but our Bureau of Prisons don't disaggregate that data. So hopefully we'll figure out a way to do that. But as you can see, what we'd really like to do is invest our dollars as a state in putting students through college. But in this case, we are often not doing that for many students because they're dropping out before they get to the point of having that choice. And secondarily, we believe that many of them are not actually entering into even the possibility of going to college or graduating from high school. This is just some basic data looking at the different rates. It's clear that there are some districts that are doing a better job than others on a one-year basis. And as a state, we don't benchmark against them. And we believe that that's one thing that we could do as a state, both benchmark against our best schools and our best districts in terms of determining performance. And so when we look at what we can do differently, I've already talked about some of those strategies, but clearly we do need better systems. We need early warning systems. Again, Dr. Rumberger talked about those throughout. But we have some wonderful data systems at many districts. And one of the problems is that we just don't utilize them to their full extent. We know who the students are who are truant. I used to run SARB, actually. And we know who the students are who have, various other warning signs. The number of Ds that they might be carrying, the number of Fs that we might be carrying. But we very rarely put that information in the hands of principals and teachers. And I think that that's something that we as a state and as policymakers, we could be doing much more consistently to have that happen at the district level. I also think that we could be holding districts more accountable for their dropout rates and closing dropout factories. Now, Dr. Rumberger pointed out a report we released not so long ago about our persistently underperforming schools in the state. There were 188 of them that were identified. A disproportionate number of those were schools in very few districts that had also been identified previously as dropout factories. Now, we looked at these schools and found that 75% of these 188 schools had received about $265 million in state school improvement money, either QEIA or HPSG, over the previous 6 years. and yet they remained persistently underperforming. So when you look at the strategies that had been taken, what our argument is that perhaps we should start thinking about alternative strategies at this point, such as allowing these schools to establish instructional and staff stability over time. So rather than going through seniority-based bumping processes, they're able to retain more of their teachers given the higher needs. Or that they're able to do some different types of things around identifying who their best teachers are, using incentives to bring teachers who may have some different types of experiences or different skill sets or high-need skill sets into those schools. We very rarely, and even in the SIG applications that just came through, we see very few of these strategies. Extending the school year. What a wonderful strategy as a possibility. Having Saturday classes, those types of things are very, very rarely done. And lastly, high-quality interventions. We do believe that our students need access to high-quality interventions, the dropout programs, the most effective teachers, and rigorous and relevant coursework. But in the end, I'm looking at this both as a practitioner and as a representative of an organization, the Education Trust West, that advocates on behalf of Latino and African American students. I think it's partly about the choices that we make, it's partly about the attitudes and perceptions, and it's partly about accountability. I mean, I have seen some very interesting choices. I used to run the San Diego Adolescent Pregnancy Program, and last year that program, which did a very wonderful job of keeping young pregnant women and recent mothers in school, had an extraordinarily high graduation rate, had its funding cut. So 3/4 of its staff at one point I had to tell they were going to be laid off. Now, that program received bridge funding from First Five in order to survive for one more year. But it's a question for us as a state, and it's a question for you all as state leaders. Are those the types of choices that we would want to be making at the local level? Whether or not we're going to have young pregnant women get the support that they need to stay in school. I've also seen other interesting choices at a district level. I mean, one thing that we're going to be coming out with recently is a report on how many summer school programs have been eliminated over the course of the last few years. Now, we give districts, and we talk about giving districts flexibility, but it's very interesting to me that the flexibility that they choose is often that flexibility which is most directly associated with changing the lives and the trajectories of the students that need it the most. Most summer school programs in our state happen to also be the credit recovery programs that we try to utilize to keep students from dropping out of school. Now, I happen to observe a school district where the choice was between eliminating a dropout prevention program or eliminating summer school or raising a copay by $5. Again, an unacceptable choice, and I can tell you what the choice that they made in the end. So, and I think it's also about attitudes and perceptions. You see this consistently at a school district level, but you also see it consistently in the data. That we have this notion of a comprehensive high school, but for some reason, comprehensiveness doesn't encompass a vast majority of our students. I always used to say to these principals, if you don't want to take this young man or young woman back from incarceration, or if you don't want to take this young man or woman back from this situation or from that situation, or if this young man or woman doesn't fit your school or fit your program, then why do you call yourself comprehensive? Those are the types of questions that I would love to have answered, and it's also the types of questions that I think lead into the next level, which is accountability. We clearly lack a level of accountability in the state. If we're able to have these dropout factories year after year after year, we continue to pour money into them, perhaps we should look at different systems of accountability. I know that New Orleans and Louisiana took the step a few years back of establishing the Recovery School District, where they actually pulled out some of their lowest performing schools and placed them in an alternative setting. Many states under the Race to the Top process are talking about doing something similar. One thing that we do have in the state are some wonderful charter management organizations that run different schools all over the state. I think it's fully possible that our state could engage in a similar process, perhaps even using some of the great school districts that we know are doing a wonderful job. So I believe that there's a lot of different aspects, a lot of different possibilities that just haven't been tried before, partly because to some extent they're politically unacceptable. But I think also at the same time, I think, we We also have to look at our state in terms of its long-term fiscal stability and addressing the budget crisis. I think Dr. Rumberger, again, pointed it out correctly. More money is going to make a difference, but it's not the answer in and of itself. It's what you do with the money, and it's the accountability that's accrued once that money is spent. Once our state solves that problem, I do believe we will get well towards solving the problem of the dropout crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that we're short on time, but I did want to ask Russ Rumberger to come up one last time, because what this hearing highlights is you can hear whenever there's, I say the same thing about the state legislature, whenever there's 10,000 problems that can be identified, it's very easy to get bogged down in all of the problems and then get paralyzed into taking action on nothing. So focusing on a few things that we can do at the state level and give the most opportunities to the districts to solve these problems. Can you, after just hearing all the testimony, give me a sense of what would you think if we could only do two things after this hearing? What would those two things be?
Okay, you put me on the spot. Okay,
Yeah.
two things I would recommend is, I think it would be at the state level is to put some concerted effort in a couple of places to see what's possible. So I think picking the right partners would be key, but I think mayors clearly have a role to play, and we've heard some really good examples from Mayor Johnston about what she's doing. But find willing communities who are willing to try maybe some of these more radical ideas out, or whatever they would be, but find some places to try things, because I think one of the things it would do is give hope to illustrate what's possible. I still think we don't have a good sense about what's possible, so I think that would be one thing I would recommend. If I had to do one other thing, I think the other challenge is to facilitate learning about all the things that are going on around the state that other people might adopt or learn from. I mean, I think the Mayor's Roundtable idea of trying to do this inventory is the first step. I'm not sure the details of it, but something whereby the state can help facilitate sharing information across places to try things. And I guess related to that would be to support an evaluation component so that we know when it's working or not, right? Because I think a lot of local districts especially don't have the capacity to do good evaluation. So this is something like the University of California can and should play a role in, and we actually have a brand new evaluation center that just got funded from the Office of the President. So that's part of what their job is, to help partner with local districts do evaluation. So I think the state could help be a facilitator. So those would be two things.
Thank you so much. I promised that we'd have public comment also, and before that, I'm going to have, Assemblymember Berryhill.
Yeah, when you say facilitate the ability to share information and best practices, are there any programs at the state level that help with that? Or, I mean, what would that look like in legislation? Would we...
Well, I think it would be something that have to be done from the State Department. That's the best place.
From the Department of Education versus the legislature.
Whether you have to mandate it in a bill.
Right.
No. I mean, hopefully not everything like this has to be done through legislation.
But, yeah.
I mean, a start of it is the bill, SB 1251, that's mandating the dropout report that's going to come out. So an add-on to that, or an extension of that, could be an inventory of practices. The only caution I would offer is that we want to make sure they're truly best practices. In other words, just because they exist don't mean they're effective. So we got to be really careful about promoting and replicating practices that may in fact not be really effective, and that's where the evaluation part comes in. So I think the state could help facilitate that, and not necessarily through legislation. I mean,
right.
Thank you. Thank you. So since I did promise public comment, I wanted to make sure that we at least did that portion. We can turn a microphone on the end of the dais. So does anybody want to add anything about their own experiences? You can come to this microphone right here. Up front works too, if you come right up here.
I'd like to stand here if I may. Basically, I'm rather well educated in behavioral science. I started in 1948. I have over 65 years experience in behavioral science, and my wife has something like like 35 years, so over 100 years. But basically, we know this science so well, and it's so simple that it's hard to believe. But our fundamental problem is in our textbooks. And I challenge anyone here to pick up a textbook on elementary algebra and get more than 3 pages into it before you wonder what in the world they're talking about or writing about. But basically, I failed in mathematics in 1934, and it devastated my career in engineering. And so anyway, some 30 years after that, I stumbled across a new course being given by Encyclopedia Britannica in Walnut Creek, and they were testing new textbooks. Now, what was unique about these textbooks was that they had rewritten them in front of real life students. And wherever they said something that was unclear or confusing, they took it back and they rewrote it. Okay? Make sense? All right? Okay. So anyway, they went ahead and they completed all the courses up through spherical trigonometry. Now, I took elementary mathematics in an evening school with 40 other mathematics dropouts who had failed as children. And we took that course, and the teacher had nothing to say. Later, I looked to see what he was reading so energetically. He was reading romance novels. And what we did in these textbooks was they were so perfected, so crystal clear, that every one of us got an A+. Now, the thing is that we finished also a lot faster than ordinary. Now, using some of these same principles that I have in this book, which is free to anyone that wants to ask for it, we had our little child, our little daughter. She was born in 1973, but my wife and I conceived her, and I was almost 60, and she was well over 50. Now, the problem with that was that normally you can expect, behavioral problem, and she was born mentally retarded. But anyway, using these simple principles in here, she was reading at 3. She understood. She was reading the headlines out of newspapers. And not only that, when we were driving around, I built up her seat in the front car. She was reading things like hotel, street signs, and so forth. All right? She went ahead through school. Every several years, she'd come and say, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I graduated. I didn't graduate, but I skipped another grade." She graduated from the University of California, 18. Went on to law school, top of her class. Okay, now what I'm suggesting is this. Now, I tell you, there's a problem with this education, this clear textbooks that I'm talking about, and that is that we have in this state and other states what we call the violence industry. And this is supported by teachers. It's supported by correctional officers. Can you imagine what's going to happen to them if, for example, we have textbooks that are self-teaching that really, really teach? See, we're going to need about half as many teachers. And guess what happens to our budget? We don't have to pay them. They get $50,000 to $60,000 a year.
I hear your point. I think the point was once raised about cars. If somebody could create a car that only cost $500, the car companies would probably be the first ones to say there was something wrong with it. But thank you. I want to make sure that we have time to open up comment. But nice to see you again. I did meet you and your wife at a town hall once before. So, yeah, thank you very much. Any other public comment?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Assembly Member, for inviting me. I'm Kathy Nichols-Washer, Superintendent of Lodi Unified School District. Thank you for sending the flyer. I appreciate that. Thank you for your interest in this issue. Superintendents throughout the state, of course, are concerned about this, but we are in crisis. And I appreciate all the research and theory that was presented today, and I agree with 99.9% of it. Right now, we are struggling to survive. And the flexibility issue that was mentioned before, I know there are exceptions to every rule, but I'm going to have to say on behalf of superintendents in the state of California, we are not abusing the flexibility that you have given us. We are using the flexibility to keep our doors open. And if it weren't for that flexibility, Lodi Unified would have several doors shut. We started in July. Schools don't start in September, as you know. Most Lodi and Stockton Unified started in July. Many schools are gearing up to start next week. One issue, a current issue that could help the dropout is the whole issue of kindergarten start time, age. I know that that was a recent bill that was discussed, and I know that it's been changed and modified. But that's an easy thing, and I don't think it costs the state any money. We don't start in September anymore. We have children who are 4 years old for more than 50% of their kindergarten year. That's hard. That's hard on kids. That's hard on teachers, especially with the class sizes being raised so high. That can help the dropout rate because, as was stated by the research, it starts early. It doesn't start in high school. I would suggest not having a whole complicated identification and evaluation assessment system. You don't need that. Teachers can tell you who's at risk. Ask a kindergarten teacher. Ask a third grade teacher. They'll tell you. Yes, we need a basic system, but to really understand who's at risk, the teachers know, and they know how to work with the kids. I would encourage you in whatever efforts are put forward that it be kept clean. And what I mean by that is a lot of times efforts that are good, efforts that are effective get bogged down with adult issues, and the focus is lost on kids, and we need to keep it focused on kids. So as you're going through this process, I would encourage you to talk to practitioners. If you have a program that you're interested in, ask a practitioner, how is it working, or how would this work in your system? Because those that are working with the kids on a day-to-day basis will tell you. They'll tell you what the pitfalls might be. They'll tell you where the problem spots might be. They'll tell you where you can save money with that program, that it might not be so expensive. Just a couple more things. I would encourage you to use research as your foundation, but not your only source, to talk to folks out in the field. I would encourage you to look at laws that are outdated that could help in this area. We're dealing with laws from 1964. We're asking for waivers from the State Board for laws from 1964. That's ridiculous. There are a lot of laws like that that can help clean things up. When you're looking at dropout rates, I applaud our mayor in Stockton because she never forgets that there are Lodi schools in Stockton too. And we're just a little piece of Stockton, but that's nice that she acknowledges us. Those kinds of things are working. And so I applaud you for listening to her, and thank you for coming, because that's what's really going to help us. Excuse me, I'm talking fast. I have to get to a 2x2 meeting this afternoon. It's working everywhere. It is a community effort. It's not a school issue. This is a community issue. The demographics, somebody asked about demographics. That does make a huge, huge difference. And the programs that work in one area may not work in another area. So I'd ask you to please consider that as well. Don't be afraid to be creative. You're creative, we're creative. Let folks be creative, come up with new ideas, reward those new ideas with funding. And my last plea for schools in the state of California, please keep the flexibility. We know that there are cuts. We know that we're funded by the state. We have to take cuts. We acknowledge that. But give us the money and then let us take care of business. Because when you have strings attached, that's when we get hung up into problems. We had to cut summer school, and we did it because we had to keep our regular classroom doors open. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think that that's a good point to bring into this topic is cuts are really impacting a lot of the school districts up and down the state right now. I do not support education cuts, but the reality is they have happened, and so some of this discussion, we may know of great programs that are happening, that were happening, that are no longer happening, and we'll have a lot of rebuilding that we need to do. But in the meantime, it is not my intention for the state to mandate a one-size-fits-all solution onto local districts on you got to do this program. I think what has come out of these hearings is the idea of having a state resource that really can pull that information together, that can share best practices and examples of programs that have been demonstrated by the research to work, that people could then choose and customize in their own districts, and to the extent that the state can play a role in making that easier for local school districts to find out how to adopt those programs so that they don't have to recreate the wheel every time, and that we don't spend a lot of money on programs that aren't demonstrated stated to work, even if they sound wonderful. But if they don't actually improve the dropout rate, then we want to be careful that we're helping to steer people in that direction without mandating a solution, given that every community's challenges are different. And I don't think that there is one solution from the state level. But from here, my hope is that we will get the recommendations of the National Conference of the State Legislators. We'll have policy recommendations coming out of the Mayor's Roundtable. We always have additional research coming out of Russ Rumberger. And trying to we're going to have a changeover in superintendents for the California Department of Education with an election in November. And the hope is that in the transition that we will be able to get this issue in the forefront at the California Department of Education and find a way to help these districts implement different solutions for addressing the dropout crisis. So that's kind of my hope on where we go from here. And did you want to have any closing remarks, Assemblymember Berryhill? Good. Yeah, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to come and participate, because it's important that we keep the dialogue up on this issue. So thank you. This concludes the Select Committee on Lowering California's High School Dropout Rate.